Welcome back to this chat about what's happening in the world today and the history behind the politics. It's been quite a day or two, has it not? And that's actually what all of your questions were really about. And I will urge you to have patience with me today, both because I'm quite tired. I was actually up all night last night, although I did sleep this morning a bit. But because when we're talking about the relationship between power, violence, and the state, that's really my wheelhouse. And so I'm going to get way too excited about some of this stuff, and like, don't roll your eyes when I get excited about the Posse Comitatus Act, if you don't mind. All right, so let me get right to it. And again, normally I would do 4 questions, and this time around I may simply do 3 because I do have 4 prepared, but I may only do 3 simply because the 3 ones are very, very big. And again, it was interesting because almost all of your questions, both the ones that were on Facebook and the ones that came to me either through email or through direct messaging, were all really on the same topic. So there was they were very easy to group. And so I may not mention your question, but I think you'll know that you're one of the people who falls into one of these 3 or 4 categories. So let's start here with Nancy Mullen, who said, and again, when I say these, when I read these questions, it's me paraphrasing them. So if the person doesn't sound smart, it's because I'm missaying it, not because they wrote it badly. Anyway, Nancy Mullen said, "Can I talk about Trump's threats to use martial law, as he's put it, to put the military, as he put it, in charge of everything? What's legal? What precedents are there? And what might we expect?" This is really one of the central questions of civil society, really, and that is, in a civil society, who is going to have a monopoly on violence? And that's really, if you think about it, a profound question. Who should be the people who are able to force other people to do things? And in most developed nations, the state has a monopoly on violence. The state says, we're really the people who get to regulate who can use guns or who can use violence. And that's been developed over time because you didn't really want to have a situation where you had a number of people running their own militias, for example. And in America, the history of who has a monopoly on violence has been debated and changed dramatically in the late 19th and the 20th century. And I really didn't have time to go into that all, although I urge you to think about who you think should have a monopoly on violence. But one of the few things I will tell you about the changes in that over time are that in the late 19th century, we actually get a real move to monopolize violence on the part of the state, for the simple reason that after the Civil War, there are a number of fraternal organizations that try to really sort of shore up the weaknesses of an industrial society, so that basically, if you're a worker and you get hurt, your wife and kids are going to starve, because there's no social safety net unless they're fraternal organizations. So there's this period in the late 19th century when we have a number of major fraternal organizations, and some of my older listeners are going to remember some of those names. Of course, now I can't think of a single one. The Society of the Cincinnatus, I think, is one of them. Of course, they're all completely gone from my head, but there were a whole bunch of these, and some of them were big enough and important enough that they actually fielded their own armies. And at one point, one of them, and of course now I can't remember which one it was, had more guns than the army did. And at that point, the Congress said, "Now hold on a second here. We got to regulate who actually can be acting like an army." And that happens in about the period that I'm going to tell you a lot about today. And there's a lot of intertwining stories that I'll tell you today about these periods. So I always think that's interesting. And of course, our understanding of who can be licensed to have a gun and what guns are going to look like is then going to change dramatically in the 20th century once we get really automatic weapons after World War I. So we're going to start to see some kind of pullback on who gets automatic weapons, and we get regulation, we get all kinds of stuff, and from then on. But anyway, for the late 19th century, there's a real question over who should have a monopoly on violence. All right, so why do we care about that? We care about that because the fundamental law in America today about what the federal government can do, what the Army can do, is limited by a 1878 law called the Posse Comitatus Act. And I'm fascinated by the Posse Comitatus Act. I've written about it a lot. It's one of my big things. And the reason for it is this. Again, coming out of the Civil War, it's really not clear what the relationship is between the state and violence. And in 1877, we get our first national strike, where workers strike against a railroad system, and significantly against the owner of that railroad system, a man named Thomas A. Scott. And Thomas Scott was very deeply involved in the United States government. He worked with Andrew Carnegie, but he was also kind of a wheeler dealer. He was a rich guy, and he had been instrumental in throwing the 1876 election to the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, despite the fact that the Democrat Samuel Tilden had actually won the popular vote. And Thomas A. Scott goes to the South, and he says, "Listen, if you're willing to like turn your electoral votes over to Hayes, I'll make sure you get government contracts and a couple other things as well, but you'll get railroads down here." And so he was known in 1876 as one of the people who had managed to pull off the election of Rutherford B. Hayes and putting him into which put him into the White House in March of 1877. All right, so why does this matter? Because in July of 1877, workers strike against Thomas Scott and against his railroad. And when that happens, we get really our first national railroad strike. And again, in the late 19th century, we're working out the issues of violence. We're also working out issues of power and the relationship in a capitalist society between the workers and the industrialists. And when, in fact, the workers go on strike against Scott, what happens is the president calls out the army in order to restore order along the railroad lines. And the strikes have been very violent in the middle of July. And so he calls out the army. All right, so if you're an observer in 1876 or 1877, first of all, 1876, you're like, what is that guy doing down there? If you're a Democrat, you're like, what is that guy doing down there in South Carolina? And why is he wielding so much power? And then a matter of months later, the US government is using federal troops to protect his business. Now, there's a long history behind that, but if you're looking at this at the time, and if you're a Democrat who has just seen your president or your presidential candidate who won the popular vote be replaced by a Republican who lost the popular vote, first time it happened in American history, and then a matter of months later, the US government calls out the army to protect that guy's property, you've got a real issue with it. And so on the heels of that, this is in 1877, on the heels of that, in 1878, Congress passes the Posse Comitatus Act. And what the Posse Comitatus Act says is that the federal troops cannot be used against American citizens. They can't be used in a domestic context. And that's really important. That's 1878. And that does a number of things. One of the things it does is that it means that the army is not going to be used to protect corporations, at least technically. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that, which itself has a very interesting history, which ask me another day, because that has everything to do with William Tecumseh Sherman and his brother John Sherman, who's a senator, and with the Lakota. But what that says is you can't use the army against Americans. So that's 1878, and I'm going to expand on this a little bit, and then I'm going to go back and tell you more about it, because as I say, this is just such a fascinating and important law. So this is 1878, and one of the things I like to emphasize is that our military and our all the branches of that, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, they have been here a long time, and for all that most of us may not come into contact with any except those of our sons and daughters or whomever who are working in those branches of the military. They have a long history, and they have a long, sometimes dishonorable history, but a very long honorable history. And that long history really, really, really matters, because there is a sense of guardrails and a sense of this is how we have to do things. One of the reasons that military law, for example, is so specific is because of their traditions and their understanding that you must be certain in a military situation that you can't let people sort of make a gut sense decision that they actually have to follow the rules, because they've been around long enough to understand that that really matters. So the reason I mention this is because originally Posse Comitatus only applied to the army. However, the other branches of the military have voluntarily said we will be bound by Posse Comitatus, even though we were not named originally in the Posse Comitatus Act. The group that is not bound by the Posse Comitatus Act and has not adopted that is the Department of Homeland Security, which is new under George W. Bush, and which is staffed by political appointees. And unlike the military, it does not have a long history. It's very new. And this is the organization under which we have ICE agents, for example. And this is one of the reasons that people like me have been upset about ICE agents since the beginning, because they don't have this history. They don't consider themselves bound by Posse Comitatus, and they are kind of ready to get into trouble, if you will, because they don't, to my mind, have that historical background. All right, so if that's what Posse Comitatus is, how does this play out? Well, one of the things that I want to tell you about Posse Comitatus, I'm going to tell you two tidbits. One is that this is one of the reasons that there is such trouble for native populations in the late 19th century, because if the army, who are the people who are in charge of the Indian reservations, can't be used against other Americans, that means that the army in the West cannot protect Indians against incursions by white settlers under the Posse Comitatus Act. So it's one of those things that's really this weird, like it looks like it's an important and good law, but it completely injures the native populations. And this is one of the reasons we get the rise in after 1878 of Indian police, and they often get a bad rap in literature because people are like, oh, they're turncoats. You know, why are they working for the militaries or the policing system, the white policing system? Well, they're doing that because under the Posse Comitatus Act, otherwise the Indians have no protection, because the army, which is supposed to be protecting them, can't be used against the white guys and African Americans too, but it's mostly white people in the West. I shouldn't say that. That's a long story too. But other Americans who are basically moving on to reservation lands and moving on to Indian lands, partly to cause trouble, but also, most important, in the late 19th century, to graze. So they push their animals onto Indian land and they eat up everything. And then the Indians can't put their animals on anything, and they've lost all the real value of their grazing land because the cattle and the other animals from the American settlers have pushed into their land. Nobody can do anything about it, which is how we get the development of Lakota, for example, police. And the Lakota police, of course, are going to go on to have their own history tied up with the Lakota tribe. But that is a reflection of the importance in the West of the Posse Comitatus Act. All right, I'm not done yet. The reason I know so much about the Posse Comitatus Act is because under George W. Bush, Dick Cheney hated the Posse Comitatus Act, and he wanted very much to get rid of it. He thought it was messy, and it meant that the army couldn't do stuff he would like it to do. And so he made sure that somebody compiled into this really thick book every time the Posse Comitatus Act had been invoked or changed or anything. And I was writing a book that had to do with this issue in the 1870s, so of course I read the book. And I love the fact that that Dick Cheney was so concerned about the Posse Comitatus Act, he made sure somebody pulled all this together. It's a really big book, and I bet there's like 4 of us who've read it, and it was it's fascinating. And if you're interested, you can probably find it at a university library near you or something. But I just think it's interesting that Posse Comitatus, as far forward as the George W. Bush administration, is important. All right, now I'm going back. I've done the Posse Comitatus Act. I've done how that matters to indigenous populations. And I want to talk then about how it played out in the late 19th century. So, of course, here we've got strikes happening all the time in the late 19th century. And now the Democrats in Congress have said you can't use the army against strikers. And interestingly enough, a lot of Republicans in Congress are like, what are you saying? Of course we have to be able to use the army against strikers. But the Democrats say, take a hike. Look what you guys just did in the Great Railroad Strike. We're not going to let you do that again. All right, so that causes a problem during this time of strikes. And there's a fascinating moment in 1894 when there's another major strike coming out of Chicago, which is going to be important in a minute on another question. Coming out of Chicago, when the workers at George Pullman's Pullman Palace Car Company strike, because their wages have been going down, even though they still have to pay the same amount of rent to the company that owns their housing, and the same amount of prices or the same level of prices at the company store. They go on strike. And this is 1894. It's right after the Panic of 1893, when a lot of stuff is coming apart, but the stuff that's coming apart is really coming apart because of a problem in the railroad lines. But anyway, so there's this strike, and when there is a strike, in order to make it really stick, the leader of the American Railroad Union, a man named Eugene V. Debs, says to his workers across the country, don't handle any trains that have a Pullman Palace car on them. So we're going to make this a national strike. So you guys just refuse to handle any trains that have a Pullman car on them. So George Pullman is in Chicago, and he wants his trains to get going again. And the governor of Chicago is a man at this point named John Peter Altgeld, and I'm going to tell you more about him in a minute. And John Peter Altgeld was willing to call out the National Guard, this Illinois State Militia, which is our state troops, to help. But when Pullman went to the president, Grover Cleveland, who's a Democrat actually. He goes to Grover Cleveland and he says, I want the feds in here. Cleveland couldn't go in because of the Posse Comitatus Act. So he goes to John Peter Altgeld and he says, hey, I'm here. Let's come in and clean this out. And Altgeld says, ain't happening. This is my state, and I'm not going to let you come in here and start bashing the heads of my Illinois people. So you can't do this. So what happens is that Cleveland's attorney general, who's a man named Richard Olney, and he is a railroad lawyer, and he's actually on retainer from railroad companies, even though he is the attorney general. He actually makes significantly less as attorney general than he makes on retainer for railroad companies. He hatches a plan to get around the Posse Comitatus Act. And what he does is he makes sure that every train in America that has a Pullman car on it also has a federal mail car on it. So the strikers can't not handle a Pullman car without not handling the U.S. mail. That means all of a sudden that they are committing a federal crime, and he has an excuse to go in and fight back against the strikers on the railroad lines because they are refusing to handle the federal mails. All right, so where does that? What comes from that? So this is how we get the giant Pullman strike, which basically shuts down the country. Because nobody will handle railroad cars until he's got the troops out there trying to get people to handle the mail cars. What comes of this is that Debs is so mad by this that he becomes a socialist. And he, in 1897, launches the Social Democracy of America, which is the precursor to the Socialist Party of America. And in 1900, he runs for president for the first time as a socialist, and he's going to run for 5 more times as a socialist to try and become president, a socialist president of America. All right. So why do I go on about this, about the Posse Comitatus Act, when what we're talking about today is the Insurrection Act? Because Posse Comitatus remains the primary law under which the U.S. military functions. So, for example, if you go and look at their paperwork, at how the DoD, Department of Defense, is going to handle any kind of military issue, and mind you, these things are really clearly written out. I'm actually thinking about writing about this tonight, and I could link to these if anybody's interested. The first thing they say is this right here. This is the first thing on the list of details of how they're going to respond and what their rights are to respond to different kinds of military threats. This is what the first thing says, quote, the primary restriction on DoD, Department of Defense, the primary restriction on DoD participation in civilian law enforcement activities is the Posse Comitatus Act. It provides that whoever willfully uses any part of the Army or the Air Force as a posse comitatus or otherwise to execute U.S. laws except in cases and under circumstances expressly authorized by the Constitution or Act of Congress, shall be fined under reference N or imprisoned for not more than 2 years or both. Okay, so we're done, right? Except we're not, of course. There are very carefully detailed exceptions to the Posse Comitatus Act, and I'll explain to you why they are. The same thing I just read you goes on to say, federal military commanders have the authority in extraordinary emergency circumstances where prior authorization by the president is impossible and duly constituted local authorities are unable to control the situation, to engage temporarily in activities that are necessary to quell large-scale, unexpected civil disturbances because, and there's a list of these, but the first one is, such activities are necessary to prevent significant loss of life or wanton destruction of property and are necessary to restore governmental function and public order. There's another reason they can do it, and that is when duly constituted federal, state, or local authorities are unable or decline, it's going to be important, to provide adequate protection for federal property or federal governmental functions. And then it goes on and on and on. This document I'm talking about is many, many, many pages long. All right, so what is that saying? It's saying that the Posse Comitatus Act can be overridden by acts of Congress or in special circumstances. So one of those, of course, is the fact that the president has the authority to nationalize National Guards. So our National Guards are the answer to the Posse Comitatus Act. They are state-driven military units that are designed to guarantee that if you are operating in a state, the people who are operating there are going to be members of your state, so they're less likely to do something outrageous. And this again is from the Posse Comitatus Act, when you had people moving in from other states into West Virginia, for example, where the heart of that was, and opening fire because they didn't care. Now, theoretically, if you'd had people from West Virginia out there, they would not have fired on their own people. So we have the National Guards. The federal government, the president can federalize the National Guards. That's one of the laws. The other one is the Insurrection Act. And the Insurrection Act comes from a number of places, but its most often cited version is from 1807. And that's actually really significant that it's 1807. And the reason I'm kind of laughing because it's like, here I am and the world is burning around us, and I'm like, let's get excited about 1807. But the reason we want to get excited about 1807 is the reason the law was so important that year is because it's right after the Haitian Revolution. And the Haitian Revolution was a moment in which enslaved peoples in Haiti rose up and took over their government and committed, if you will, and this is obviously from the perspective of the people writing the laws, an insurrection. And Americans were terrified, white Americans who are making the laws are terrified that that kind of insurrectionary, in their minds, impulse is going to come to America. And they want to be sure that if that happens in some of these states where African Americans made up a very strong minority or even a majority, that if that were the case, that the feds could send in troops and stop an enslaved insurrection. All right, so it's this 1807 law, and in this law under the Insurrection Act, it says, again a quote here, whenever the president considers that unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages, or rebellion against the authority of the United States make it impracticable to enforce the laws of the United States in any state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings, he may call into federal service such of the militia of any state and use such of the armed forces as he considers necessary to enforce those laws or to suppress the rebellion. All right, theoretically, the idea behind the Insurrection Act is still that the federal troops will supplement rather than replacing the state laws. And the expansion of this law, and the reason I read it carefully there about the laws not being enforced in a state, is because that section of the law was written in 1956 to enforce civil rights acts, because Southern states simply said, we're not going to do it. So this is, I'm trying to emphasize here that the history of these acts is not, is an accumulation of things that you might approve of or things that you might not approve of. Okay. So what this says is that, we got the Posse Comitatus Act, and it's a major guardrail. But there are times when the president can override that, and he can override that under the Insurrection Act. What this means is that, and the person you really want to be following about this, if you're interested in it, is a guy named Dr. Steve Vladek. He's from University of Texas Law School, and he's been writing tweet threads on this nonstop for 2 days. He's just done a podcast. I think it's at Lawfare blog, and the New York Times is quoting him right and left. Very interesting reads, maybe a little bit heavy on the law for people who aren't really into the law, but understandable. And my guess is that, I've not listened to the podcast, but my guess is it's very good. His name again is Steve Vladek, Vladek. All right, so one of the things he says about this is, if this is the case that really the president can do whatever he wants, why don't they use it all the time? Well, the checks, as he says, are political. It is really unpopular for troops to be turned against people, as we discovered last night. And generally, first of all, under the law, the president has first to ask people to disperse. And then if they don't disperse, then he can do something. But second of all, generally, under the Insurrection Act, the president has asked governors if they want help. And this has happened in recent memory. It happened in 1992, after the Rodney King riots in LA, when the governor of California did, in fact, ask the president to help out and to send in troops to try and calm LA. But in this case, and it happened after 9/11 as well. But in this case, the Democratic governors that it appears President Trump is threatening when he says he's going to send in troops, they have come out today in the news and said, no, we don't want them. So we have Andrew Cuomo of New York saying, I would say thanks, but no thanks. You have Tim Walz of Minnesota saying, no, I'm good. And crucially, you've got J.B. Pritzker of Illinois. And the reason that I made such a big deal about John Peter Altgeld before in Illinois is because Illinois, until really recently, still lionized Altgeld for standing up to the federal government at that time. So when Pritzker says no, he is building on that Illinois history of saying, don't you dare send troops in here the way you did to John Peter Altgeld, because basically that made Altgeld's career from then on, is because he was the guy who stood up to the federal government and said, no, I'm not going to have you firing on my strikers. Pritzker today said, quote, I reject the notion that the federal government can send troops into the state of Illinois, unquote. And that's an absolute echo of John Peter Altgeld. All right, so now all that being said, and I've given you this long history of these two really cool acts that are deeply entwined into our history, we have something else on the table right now, and frequently in American history, that is not getting any attention right now, although it did last fall. And that is that under emergency acts, the president has astonishingly wide powers. And among those wide powers are the ability to shut down the internet, for example, to block cell phones, to do virtually anything, to suspend habeas corpus, to establish military law, martial law, to basically do anything. It's basically whatever the president wants. And we have a number of these again and again and again, these emergency acts. We are under an emergency act, a number of emergency acts right now. And I've talked in the past about how those operate and how they how they're supposed to be reviewed, and they really have not been. A number of scholars really think we have to revisit our laws about emergency acts. But while we're all focusing on Posse Comitatus and on the Insurrection Act, it's worth remembering that we are technically the emergency acts can pretty much do anything they want. Now, to tie into this, people ask me every single day, and the very first talk I did on this was about this. Is he going to postpone the election or cancel the election? And yeah, I suppose it's possible, but I look at that and I think, why? You know, the thing to worry about is not the postponement or the canceling of an election, but rather an election that's held on time, but that is rigged by either making sure that Democrats can't vote, that certain places are locked down, and I've talked a lot about this, by skewing the final tallies, by any number of things. I have every expectation that this election is going to happen when it is supposed to happen. I have less faith that it's going to be a free and fair election. And if you remember, most autocracies now have elections. You know, Vladimir Putin has elections. He just wins them by extraordinary numbers. And that's much more what I would be concerned about than by worrying about having a postponed election. All right. That's probably more than any of you wanted to know, but come on, you got to admit the Posse Comitatus Act is really cool. And the fact that we are still dealing with the aftermath of the Haitian rebellion, the Haitian insurrection, the Haitian revolution in 2020 says just how important history is. All right. Katie Higgins-Croat said she wants to know about the history of fascism and how close are we to that today. And this one I really like because I can't tell you the history of, Germany. I can't tell you the history of Italy. I can't tell you any number of these histories. Boy, I can tell you the history of ideas and the history of ideology. And I am fascinated by fascism. So I'm going to tell you the history of fascism, and then I'm going to tie it into something that Ned McDonald asked. He said, what is it that motivates the oligarchy to crush the middle class? Can't they see that a prosperous middle class means a better economy for everybody? How do you explain such acquisitiveness? All right. Fascism. You hear again and again, or you find it on Twitter, people saying that the fascists are socialists, that Nazi actually has the word socialism in it. They are on the left. And this is one of those things that you can just watch historians break out in hives when they say, because there is, as there is with almost all sayings like that, a grain of truth in it, in that fascism came out of socialism. But it took a major 180. So let me walk you through the ideas behind fascism. And what I'm not going to get into here at all is the history of Italy and how how this matters in the development of the concept of fascism because of the fight about whether or not Italy should be involved in World War I, which is hugely important in the development of fascism. But, oh, come on, you've just learned all this other stuff. You can't have everything. Plus, I don't really know Italy at all, to be honest. All right, so what happens is I'm going to focus here not on the general history of fascism and all the different names that went into that, but rather on Benito Mussolini from Italy, but also on the problem of, well, the problem of socialism, if you will. And this I just love. So you have coming out of the late 19th century, and I'll try to be a little short because there's at least one more question I want to get to, but this stuff is so great and it's so important for who we are now. So coming out of the late 19th century, you have this concept, this growing concept based in the philosophy of Karl Marx, that there's going to be a workers' revolution. And I'm not going to go into all the history of that. Marx is a philosopher. Other people try and put it into practice, but let me just tell you, cut to the chase here. They've got a real problem, and this is a real problem, and this is the water that I swim in. They have a real problem. I am not at all a Marxist, by the way, but the problem is if the working class is moving toward this revolution, why isn't it happening? Like you got this, everybody should want to do this, and they're not. And this is a huge problem for a number of communist thinkers and a number of socialist thinkers. They really want to make the revolution happen, but it's not. So what are they? What's the problem? And that plays out in America in really, really cool ways. But that's not the question you asked. You asked about the rise of fascism. So what a number of socialist thinkers come to play around with about 1900, big abouts here, is, well, the problem is that workers can't see outside their own very small world. And so what they really need are a few people to lead them to the promised land, if you will. They're the few people who need to say, you're caught in your bubble and you can't see beyond it. So you need guiding lights like us to pull you forward into the revolution. And those ideas are very important, as I say, in American history and obviously in Russian history. But for my purposes today on the rise of fascism, those ideas are swimming in the water. And you have the socialist movement in Italy. And I'm going to focus on Mussolini. And Mussolini is frustrated like all other socialists are. And he's like, as my mother would have said, trying to get people over the finish line to revolt and have a revolution, as my mother would have said, although she was not a revolutionary, she would have said it's like trying to get chickens across the road. Like you just can't make them do it, or trying to herd cats. You can't make it happen. So what's the problem? So he's playing around with these ideas, and he gets into trouble with whether or not Italy should enter World War I. That's, again, a major part that I'm not going to talk about because I want to focus on the ideas. So he looks at this and he's like, I don't know what's going on. I don't know why this doesn't work. And then Italy does get involved in World War I. And all of a sudden, it's like the whole country snaps to attention. And all of a sudden, they become organized and they start to move forward, and they all start to move as one unit toward a goal. And Mussolini sees this and he says, wow, this really works. If you're trying to move a whole bunch of people in a direction, there's some things that we've done in World War I that really work. And coming out of World War I, the Italian economy is in real trouble. And he looks at this and he starts to put together the idea that a few 10% or so of the population needs to move toward the revolution. And he puts together the idea that Italy sure seemed to move in a direction during World War I. And he starts to think, this whole idea of everybody being equal and this whole idea of liberal democracy is obsolete. This is really not a functioning system. And that really what you need is to have that elite, have those people who really can see what's happening. You need them to rule everything. And in order to get everybody together and move toward a goal, what you need to do is to stop talking about class and stop talking about, workers' rights, and talk about nationalism, talk about the state, talk about making our state great. And by state, I mean, obviously the boundaries of in this case, the government of Italy. Although, the state is a generic term for the governments, the government apparatus of a nation. That always just confused me what a state was, because in America we have states, but the state is the apparatus of government. So he's like, what we really need to do is to promote that, the state, the nation state, and we need to tie the economy to the government, so that everything's moving together at the same time, rather than sort of having a government that oversees this disparate state, or there's a class warfare. It's all got to be together. And in order to move everything in one direction, what you really need to do, as I say, is to recognize that not everybody is equal, that there are a few people who really can see what's going on and others who can't. And they're really the better people. They're the ones who really can make society move forward. And logically, if some people are better than others, somebody's better than everybody, right? Because if there's distinctions, you should be able to say, well, yes, if we're not all equal, if some people are better than others, well, we really, if you could put it on a clipboard, you could line up the whole nation in terms of some people being a little bit better than others. So somebody's at the very top. You can see obviously where this is going. So if this is the case, you don't want to have any kind of democracy, because people aren't all the same. You need to maintain a very rigid social structure. And you have to recognize that that some people are very much better than others, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. And you have to have everybody together. You need to have a one-party state. You can't have these warring factions, because if you have warring factions, they're going to tear apart this entire system. So If that's the case, you have a one-party state, some people are better than others, you need to have one great leader who's going to move everybody along, and you're going to tie people to this state, to this juggernaut, if you will, through the work that they do, because the state's going to be in charge of that, because really this elite has come to dominate the economy as well, and through education that really hammers on how great the state is. And you're going to focus not on reason, because you don't want people to think, you want them to stay where they are. You want to focus on emotions. You want to focus on propaganda about how great the state is, and you want to make them hate somebody so that they have an enemy to bond against. And you want to focus on the military. You want to make sure that your state is very strong and that it can go out and it can absorb more and more room as your state gets bigger and bigger. So you're focusing again and again on the nation, and on the expansion of the power of the homeland. And the whole plan for this, of course, is to move society forward under the understanding that some people are really better than others and really should direct everyone else. All right, now you can see why I'm so excited by this. If that's the ideology behind fascism, and that ideology, as I say, is really developed in the 1920s, and it comes to power in the 20s and in the 1930s. In the 1940s, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt is overseeing the American but also the Allied response to World War II, which is fascism against democracy, every single speech FDR gives is an attempt to say, we are a democracy and this is why we are better than fascism. You know, look, the fascists can't actually feed people. They can't, you know, when you go into these cities in Italy, people are starving to death. You know, the idea that trains run on time is ridiculous. The trains don't run on time in a fascist country, and they don't, by the way. And again, FDR is saying we are a democracy, we stand against this. Okay, so why am I personally, an Americanist, fascinated by fascism? Because, well, I mean, I didn't ever think it would be applicable, but I think you can see that nowadays there's a reason that people are interested in fascism in America. But I'm fascinated by it because doesn't that sound a lot like the ideology of the elite slaveholders before the Civil War? The idea that really people are not equal, that democracy was a lovely thought, except it was wrong. You actually have Alexander Stevens, when he's talking about the establishment of the Confederacy after the Southern states secede in 1860, he says we are going to erase that ridiculous idea of Thomas Jefferson's that all men are created equal. Obviously, they weren't, and now we're going to move forward with a few elites, the group that South Carolina Senator James Henry Hammond said would rest on the mudsills of society, all those people who were locked into their status for life. Those were the people who would produce, and they would stay on top. They would lift to the top that elite group that would be the group that moves society forward. That hierarchical vision of a society is very similar to the kind of ideological basis of fascism. Now, then going to Ned McDonald's idea, why, if you are an American, wouldn't you want to have a strong middle class? Having a strong middle class presupposes that democracy is our fundamental vision, that everybody is created equal, and you want to give everybody equality of opportunity to move themselves into the middle class if they are able to do so. And from that, they're going to support a few people at the very top, but you're going to have a very fluid society where anybody can rise if they want to. If you, in fact, believe that society moves forward better with a very few wealthy leaders moving it forward, you don't care about there being a strong middle class. You care about money moving upward, because the more that's at the top and the tighter you can weld your society together, the faster and farther your society will go, if in fact that's what you believe. And so I find this whole movement in Western history, but let's say American history, because that's really my thing, this movement toward, at various points, a society in which a very few people rule over everybody else, I find it absolutely fascinating, because it is this ideological thread, and it's an ideological thread in which we appear to be living again at this moment. Now, that's the history of fascism. I obviously did not take the time now to go ahead and link it to where we are today, because I have talked a lot about that in the past. I will do it again if you would like, but there's one more question to get to today that I think you all care about, because this is the one that had the most numbers. I'm sorry, there was a fourth I want to talk about too. And that is Antifa. Don Plummer says, both President Trump and Attorney General Barr are claiming the current civic unrest is being caused by Antifa and left-wing anarchist groups. But just what does that even mean? And Evelyn Ruppel said, can I explain Antifa? Great question. Antifa is, I hate to say an invented group, but in many ways it is. Antifa is very, very loose. It is a group of people who are opposed to fascism, what I just talked about. They're opposed to the rise of what they see around them as fascism. And they are opposed to the fascists, the ideological fascists, and the white supremacists who are currently supporting fascism, the neo-Nazis, for example, and the number of groups I'm going to tell you about now. That being said, Antifa is amorphous. It's not an organized group. There's not a head. There's not dues. There's simply, for the most part, a number of people who spend most of their time on the internet. Because what Antifa is best known for is what's called doxing, taking a picture of Charlottesville, where they were most prominent, taking some of the pictures that were shown in Charlottesville and figuring out who was in those pictures, and beating up an African-American man, for example, and turning that information over to law enforcement so that those people get arrested and charged. And they did that, I don't know if you remember, but after Charlottesville, almost every day there would be a number of tweets saying, can you help us identify this man in this picture? And then finally saying, this man in this picture is, I'm going to pick on the name John Smith here, and I'm making that up. There was not a person named that at Charlottesville, but let's find him. And then once they find him, then of course with the internet they know everything. And so the primary scholar of Antifa right now is a man named Mark Bray, and he's written a book on them. And he says, quote, "The idea of Antifa masterminding what's happening over the last few days, if you know anything about the subject, is ludicrous. There's a real investment on the part of the administration and their allies in portraying these recent protests as organized from the top down and not a spontaneous outpouring of rage," unquote. Bray goes on to say that Antifa probably has between 5 and 15 members in any city. They do on occasion show up and fight back against the neo-Nazis who are in the streets, but they're a very, very small group. And as I say, they're more effective on Twitter, for example, outing the neo-Nazis who are showing up in photographs. And you saw that after Milwaukee as well. Them taking pictures and saying, this is so-and-so, and he needs to lose his job most of the time, which is most of the time what actually happens. All right, so the other thing we have seen very recently is that a number of white supremacist groups are tweeting as Antifa accounts, and they've been exposed as that. So those are people pretending to be Antifa. What is more problematic is that, as you know, the President and Attorney General Barr have said that they are going to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. Well, first of all, that's illegal. You can't, under our laws, you can't identify any domestic group as a terrorist organization, so whatever. But I mean, I don't mean to be flippant. They haven't actually done it. They're saying they're going to. I could also say I'm going to, tightrope walk across this harbor, but that and $3 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Anyway, what is more problematic is what they are trying to do right now is to roll the idea of any opposition to this administration into this umbrella of Antifa, so that no matter who you are, if you're standing up against the Trump administration and the people who are in the streets that are protesting in favor of the Trump administration, you are somehow a terrorist. That is hugely problematic. Let me walk you through that a little bit. Well, Antifa is not organized in any fashion. White supremacists in America are, in fact, organized. There are a number of different groups of them, and they're tracked pretty closely by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So we have a group called the Base, which is formed around the concept of Al Qaeda. It's the American version called the Base. These are white supremacists. There's the Rise Above movement. There's Atomwaffen. There is a group right now. It's getting a lot of attention called the Boogaloo Boys. They are white supremacists, but they're hoping to collapse the U.S. government before they start a race war. There's a whole bunch of these organizations, and you know about them because they do a lot of damage. I mean, we've got Dylan Roof, for example, who was a member of a white supremacist organization who killed 9 Black Americans in Charleston, West Virginia recently. And of course, we've got what happened in Charlottesville, where the KKK turned out and a number of white supremacist organizations turned out and beat up a lot of people and killed Heather Heyer. And again, you know I care about names, another case where a name that should not be forgotten. And if you remember at the time, President Trump said of what happened at Charlottesville, there are very fine people on both sides. And that was a moment in which people should have sat up and taken notice and said, we're on a very bad path here. And a number of us did, but a lot of people couldn't believe what was really happening. So how does this happen? And how did America get to a place where the idea of people on the right is acceptable, not protesters, violence on the right is acceptable and violence on the left is not? And this is, again, the water I swim in. I'm going to truncate this a bit and say that fear of left-wing agitators in America is deeply embedded in racism and in the fears of a Black underclass rioting and killing Americans. And of course, that, I'm not going to go into the entire history of America before 1865, but that's the fear of enslaved people rising up and taking over the societies in which they live. But after the war, that fear of Black insurgency that I've talked about before gets very tangled up in Reconstruction with the concept of taxation. So the idea of African Americans having rights, I've talked about this a lot before, in the 1870s switches from being on the surface about race, although of course it's still about race. But the people who keep saying they don't want African Americans to vote keep saying, well, we don't really care that they're Black, we care that they're poor. And this idea of letting poor Americans, people who are unpropertied, have a say in society gets intimately tied into the rise of federal taxation after the Civil War. It's the Republicans during the war who invent taxation, and then when they welcome African Americans to the extent they do into the body politic, people who object to that, opponents of that, say, what you're really doing is you're advocating that poor people can redistribute wealth from hardworking white people to people of color. And that trope, the idea that poor people voting, minorities voting, and later feminist women voting will mean a redistribution of wealth, ties intimately into the idea of socialism and fears of communism. I've talked about that a lot. This then flows into the idea, the fear of organized labor, especially because organized labor is dominated, maybe not dominated, but works together with immigration, with immigrants in the late 19th century. And Americans, native-born Americans, begin to argue that immigrants, especially immigrants from Germany and Italy and Poland, are bringing over socialism and anarchy to America. And in fact, there are socialists and anarchists who come to America, but never very many. The high watermark of socialism in America is 1912, when Gene Debs is running yet again for president as a socialist. And even then, at that high watermark, Debs gets only 6% of the popular vote and garners no electoral votes. And that's the best socialists have ever done in America. There really aren't that many of them. But there is, again, the monopoly of the state, the monopoly of violence on the part of the state begins to work in the late 19th century against poor people having a say in society, against poor people voting. And you see this really dramatically, for example, in Haymarket, once again in Chicago, or in Illinois in 1886, when there's a labor meeting, and what the laborers want is an 8-hour day. hardly from our perspective a radical position. But after when they're holding this rally in Haymarket Square, it's the day after police officers had killed a worker and had injured others, and in the midst of all this, a bomb is thrown at the police, and to this day we don't know who did it. Again, one of the things I always say about history is, don't make assumptions, because you never know. And you can see that when I write these letters, I try really hard not to, as lawyers would say, assume a fact, not an evidence. We don't know who threw that bomb. Nonetheless, police opened fire. They killed 7 of their own, and at least 4 civilians, and wounded dozens of others. In the aftermath of that, 8 anarchists who were present at the meeting were convicted of conspiracy. 7 of them were sentenced to death. 1 of them was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The governor at the time commuted 2 of their sentences to life in prison, and 1 of the convicted bombers, although again there's no evidence he threw the bomb, committed suicide. And in 1893, John Peter Altgeld, I told you there was a reason I was telling you about him, pardoned the remaining defendants, and he criticized the trial. He said this was a kangaroo court. All right, so from that moment, you can see again and again and again in America this sense that there are anarchists and socialists who are trying to destabilize society. In the 1920s, we get the Palmer raids designed to clean America out of anarchists and socialists, and from that we get the ACLU trying to protect basic civil liberties for people who live here. And again, you see the rise of anti-communism in America really dramatically in the 1960s as the John Birch Society, for example, which is fascinating because that's actually patterned on communist cells. They're secret. They when they grow to a certain size, they hive off and create a new one. And they're way more Birchers than there ever are communists. But again, that fear of insurgency, the fear of the lower class demanding a share of the pie, is one that runs in American history all the way back to the beginning, but it really gets weaponized during Reconstruction by adding racism to it. And that addition of racism turns this concept of democracy into this weird mixed fear of domination by a race, but also domination of the poor and a redistribution of wealth. I'm not going to give you any more on that right now, simply because I want to end this. I try to do on a positive note. Barbara Berger said, "Has there ever been in American history a successfully led protest movement by ordinary, everyday citizens? And if so, how was it done? What is our greatest weapon," in quotation marks, she doesn't mean that literally, "other than voting in November to bring civility back to our country?" She said, right now, I'm not even sure I'd call the civil rights movement successful. And other people asked very similar things. Mickey Moore had said, it's really discouraging to hear people say that protests don't really change anything. And I will talk in the future more about protests, because I think we need to be talking about that. But I just want to go back to, has there ever been a successfully led protest movement by ordinary, everyday citizens? Yeah. The Civil War. And I don't mean that in a negative sense, not the Southerners, the Northerners, who looked at the country being taken over by an elite group of oligarchs and said, hell no, this is our society. This is our world, and we care deeply about everybody having equality of opportunity, even though we're racist, even though we're sexist, even though we really want everything for ourselves. We're willing to open the door for everyone because we believe in equality of opportunity. Where else? The Chicano movement, the African American movement, places where the American Indian movement, places where people said enough. We want a fair shake in American society. The feminist movement. Now, we're not at all at equality. We have never reached that. But I think it's significant that we try. I mean, it's much easier. People roll their eyes off and say to me, how can you believe in the American dream? It's never worked. Well, no, it hasn't. But I'll certainly take this situation over one where a president or an oligarch tells me what my role in society is, and I can't challenge that without expecting either to be killed or spend my life in a gulag. I'm perfectly happy to keep on fighting for equality, believing that it can be achieved rather than being told from the top that it can't be. So where is the other place a great popular movement has worked? In the establishment of this country. That was a really big deal. Sure, a lot of leaders talked about how ducky it would be to get rid of England, but it was really the people on the ground. And they were not a majority of them at first. And it was always dicey and it was always dangerous. But a number of them who said, yeah, we're willing to take the chance that it will be better to determine our own fate than it is to accept the positions that are being handed to us in a hierarchical society. So does a protest work? Absolutely. But how does it work is the question that I think is underlying what all of you are saying. Voting for sure, but you know what? Voting's a long way out right now. What really matters to me, anyway, and as I keep saying, I'm an idealist. I believe that ideas change society, is the way you change politicians and the way you change the way people think about things is to take up oxygen, to talk about things, to write letters to the editor, to call your Congress people, to be in the streets, to hold up signs, to change the public conversation, and to change it in ways that other people want to be part of that movement because they believe that you are standing for fundamental human principles. Looting is not a fundamental human principle. And I'm not suggesting that the people protesting Mr. Floyd's death, George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, are the looters. I think that we've got the issue of other groups coming in and trying to use this moment to destabilize American society. But when you have a movement that appeals to concepts of fairness and the idea of equality before the law and the idea that people should be able to control their own destinies, those movements, to my mind, are unstoppable. And that's what I cling to in times like these. I hope this has been useful. And if so, I will see you next Tuesday at 4 o'clock to talk about the politics and the modern world, depending on where we are that day. And on Thursday, I'm going to start a new series of history shows that are focused on the history of the Republican Party and what that can tell us about the relationship in America between equality and property, which are two of our fundamental principles in American society. All right, so there we go today. Once again, a disclaimer. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a history professor, and I do not speak for my employer when I do these. Good luck this week, everybody. Stay safe and keep the faith.